Members of the prosecution team was Jacob Robinson. He was one, he didn't take an active part in examining witnesses and arguing in court. That was done by three people. After Mr. Hausner, the Attorney General, I was the number two as State Attorney, and the District Attorney of Tel Aviv, Mr. Barot. And then there were some other people who helped. Mr. Robinson was a great historian, and he lived, and I thought he was American. We brought him from America. And I'll come back to him later, because in connection with this famous book, And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, which he published about the Eichmann trial, and an attack on the Hannah Arendt, she wrote a book on the Eichmann trial. I'll refer to that later. But Jacob Robinson was one of the advisors of Mr. Jackson during the trial of Nuremberg. And he, in fact, wrote a letter at the time to Jackson asking that Eichmann should be one of the people accused in that trial. Jackson, at the time, did not agree with this. He wanted just to sort of the major figures in the Nazi hierarchy. By the way, also President Weizmann, he suggested that he wanted to actually become one of the witnesses to describe what happened to the Jewish people. Very politely, Jackson refused that, and he added that for him, he thought that the most important thing is to bring in the documents and to prove what happened there, and not so much sort of oral evidence. Well, I personally didn't agree with it. When I was appointed one of the prosecutors, I insisted that in connection with every European country, there should at least be one live witness to tell what happened to his family, to describe the atmosphere. Because, cruel as it may sound, but even if you have documents, 100,000 killed here, 100,000 killed there, all right, so you read this and you are somehow impressed, but it doesn't give you a complete picture of what really happened, except when you really show the atmosphere. So we picked a witness who was, first of all, credible and who knew a lot and who could really describe what happened in those cases. Another thing, in connection with the Nuremberg trial, in recent years, a number of times at congresses that I was invited, in Nuremberg, in Frankfurt, I met Mr. Whitney Harris. He was the prosecutor number two. Jackson was no longer alive, but he was the second in command, and we became good friends. And, well, I think in a few days he'll be 97 years old. But it was terrific, the way in which he presented the Nuremberg case. So in Nuremberg itself and in Frankfurt, we both appeared. He described the Nuremberg trial, and I the other trial. Yes, perhaps we could show that. Here, this is the two of us standing together. Yeah, and this was when the two of us visited together Dachau concentration camp. That's also, one of these memories that are very difficult to extinguish. Now, I would like, first of all, as I told you, I was then at that time the Deputy State Attorney, and I was then appointed as the legal advisor of the police bureau. They actually vacated a whole prison for Eichmann and the police officers, about 30. There was one police officer for every country in Europe and one for every topic that was examined. I was actually, for 9 months, I lived next to Eichmann in that prison where he was kept. I informed him that until his lawyers came, if he wanted to discuss some technical points, like appointing his defense counsel, or like having connections with his family and so on, he could come to me. I let him know that I was not prepared to talk about the offenses with which he was charged, because then I would have to be a witness, and I knew that I would be one of the prosecutors in the trial. Now, first of all, about that period, just a few things that are sort of stick in my mind particularly. At first, there was some difficulty, which was strange to me, to find witnesses, because we had lists of survivors who lived in Israel, but many of them didn't want to talk about it. They said that for years they had been pushing it aside. They didn't talk to their families about it. They didn't talk to their friends about it, and they didn't want to be reminded now. So I summoned some of these people. I said, look, it's your duty towards justice, towards history, towards the Jewish people to tell what you know. Well, some didn't agree. Some did. Some even said, well, I remember someone saying, I'm the last survivor of my township, and what happened to my family is not less important than what happened to anyone else. So if you call me, I'll talk for 4 and 5 days. You won't be able to stop me. Now, of course, we didn't want the trial to take too long. So sometimes I wanted to witness only for a particular point, which was not covered by the rest of the evidence. But of course, I could understand these people, but sometimes we decided to summon another witness. Then I'll never forget the first moment that I met Eichmann. As I told you, I had informed him that only for technical reasons he could come to me. At first he didn't. So one day I had my office there in this prison, and I was reading the autobiography of Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz. Höss, not Hess, like the assistant of Hitler, Rudolf Höss. He was hanged by the Poles in 1948, 12 years before Eichmann was caught. But before he was executed, he wrote his biographical notes, sort of autobiography. And I was reading that on that day, and I read how he described how they had these many days where they had to kill 1,000 Jewish children a day. And he described how the children used sometimes to kneel down and asked to be spared. And he wrote that when he had to push the children into the gas chamber, his knees were getting a bit wobbly at times. But then he added, but after that I always felt ashamed of this weakness of mine after I talked to Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, because Eichmann explained to me that it's especially the children who have to be killed first. He says, because where is the logic, he said, that you kill a generation of older people and you leave alive a generation of young people who can afterwards be avengers and can create the race again. Now, that may not be devoid of some macabre kind of logic, but 10 minutes after I read that, they told me that Eichmann wants to see me. And I never forget hearing the steps after I just read that. And he sat opposite me like you're sitting now. It was a bit difficult to keep a poker face at that moment. And another thing, as I told you, we had, of course, information from all over the world, hundreds of files. The Germans were very cooperative, and they gave us material from all the ministries and all the Nazi documents and so on. And we had it from other places, but I was very much interested to get material from Poland, where the death camps were. And at first it was difficult. The Polish government was very anti-Israeli at the time. And they gave instructions that no one should cooperate with us. But there were many Poles who wanted to help us. So anonymously, they sent us letters without disclosing who was the one who sent this. Sometimes it was important, sometimes less. But one day, I'll never forget, I got a letter with typewritten pages where it said in 1942, 43, every day how many Jews arrived at the Auschwitz death camp and what numbers were given to them. Now that, of course, was of terrific importance from the point of view of the prosecution, but it was typed that somebody, they didn't want to show, who sent it. So we had these typewritten pages, and I don't have to explain to you that in a criminal case, we can't just hand in papers without proving that this is correct. So I summoned immediately all the police officers for a meeting. And I showed them that. I said, have any of you any idea how we can use this as admissible evidence? Well, there was quiet. No one said anything. And then I had an idea. I said, look, maybe we do the opposite what we usually do. Usually the person who prepared it and who knows the things and so on, or a stamp, But maybe I mean, there are lots of survivors from Auschwitz living in Israel. They have their numbers still on their arm. And therefore, if you say, for instance, if you did publish that all the people in Israel who were in Auschwitz and who arrived in July 1942 should come to the police and examine the number, and let's see whether the document in fact is a true document. I had not yet finished saying that, and the police commander for Poland pulled up his sleeve and he showed us the number on his arm. He said, I came in September 43 to Poland, to Auschwitz, and it was exactly the number. But you know, I had no idea until this moment that this man was from Poland. I certainly had no idea that he was from Auschwitz, but not only that, apparently he had not told this to the other police officers. Now, police officers are not known as sort of particularly soft people, but I never forget when he pulled up that sleeve, you know, all these 30 police officers for 2 or 3 minutes were just sitting there silent, just not expressing a word. I see, when you speak of moments, I mean, these are moments that are very difficult to forget. Another thing, during the examination, my instructions to the police officer, I mean, they went through millions of documents. My instructions are that whenever there's something which might be relevant, in the evening you show it to me. And then I had to decide what comes into the trial and what is, it does not be part of the prosecution material that we will hand in. Now, every day almost, someone came and showed us there was an attempt to save a particular Jewish family or a particular Jewish person for that or that reason, which was sent to Eichmann for decision. Now, when there was such a document, there was no, all these documents were chronologically arranged. So it took sometimes some days, sometimes weeks, until I found the reply of Eichmann, what Eichmann had finally decided on that. I just saw that there was a request. And I tell you, I had nightmares, I had dreams at night. You know, that one family, sometimes someone might be saved. And invariably, the moment it came to Eichmann, the result was fatal. I don't want to be theoretical too much. I want to just to give you an example of what happened. One day, the police commander for France came to me, and he showed me a letter written by a German general, the general of the Wehrmacht, the commander of Paris. He wrote to Eichmann that there was a Jewish professor, Professor Weiss, an expert on radar. And it was very important for the German army to not only to see these things, but to question this man and to get somehow directly or indirectly the assistance of that Jew, a Jewish professor, this expert on radar, and therefore he insists that this man and his wife should not be sent to the east, to the death camps. Now, I must admit, here I thought, a general of the German army, radar, important, one Jew. So here I thought that here it would succeed. A few days later, the police officer brings me the reply from Eichmann. On a point of view of principle, I cannot possibly agree to your request, and this man has to be deported. A few days later, a note. This general had called Eichmann by telephone. How dare you countermand my order? I am a general of the German army. And Eichmann's reply, and I am an Obersturmbannführer of the SS, and I don't care what rank you have in the army. A few days later, Eichmann writes to this man, I have examined this whole file further, and I found out that the patents of this Jewish professor have already been taken over by the German army. Therefore, I see no reason even for one more day to postpone the deportation of this Jew, and then the fact this man was deported to Auschwitz to his death. I mean, also in the trial itself, we divided up the things, because I was part of the investigation, all the things where Eichmann was concerned directly was actually handed in by me during the proceedings. So also all these documents and also all about France. So I handed in these documents. A few days later, my secretary came to me and said, there's a young lady outside wants to see you. who is that? Alisa Weiss. I don't know her anyway, show her in. So she said, you know, I'm Alisa Weiss, I'm the daughter of this Professor Weiss. And I was a baby when they came to fetch my parents. And my parents saw that, apparently through the window, that the SS were coming, so they sent they sent me to neighbors. The neighbor kept us and then sent us later to America. And there I read that you handed in these documents. Now, not only didn't I know my parents, I didn't even have a picture. I don't have a picture of what they looked like. Could you give me some example of what I can do to get a picture? All right. Another day, someone came and brought a document. You know, there was a fascist party in Holland. And there were some cranks, some 12 Jews who were members of the fascist party in Holland. So the leader of the fascist party in Holland wrote to Eichmann that these 12 Jews, it would be very demoralizing for the fascist party if they were sent away, because they are loyal members. And therefore he insists that these people should not be deported. He even added, to make it more attractive for Eichmann, they might even do intelligence work inside the Jewish community if they remain here, and that might even help you in your endeavors. Again, I thought here, under those circumstances, the answer of Eichmann, on a point of principle, I cannot possibly agree to your request. He added, if you say it might be demoralizing if we send them today, let's wait 2 or 3 weeks. By then, people will have got used to the deportation to such an extent that it won't make any special, no special importance anymore, and won't make any impact, and so on. Another day, a Jewish woman was in Estonia. She was arrested by the German authorities. Now, the Italian representative, the consul in Estonia from Italy, wrote to Eichmann that this woman is a widow of a high officer in the Italian army, and who fell in the fighting, and had carried out terrific acts of courage and perseverance. And he was known all over Italy, and everyone lauded this man. And therefore they insist, the Italian government and the Italian authorities, they ask that this woman should be returned to Italy, given a chance to return. Again, Italy, the ally, after all, the ally of Germany. And they ask this one woman, and the husband, such a well-known and courageous man who fell in the fight against the Allies. The answer of Eichmann, he insisted, on point of principle, I cannot possibly agree. He saw to it that this woman was sent to her death at Auschwitz. And Marshal Pétain, the Vichy, he wrote, there was someone who did that, an officer in the French army, very courageous and successful officer. He was Jewish, and he insists this man should not be deported. Eichmann saw to it that man was sent to his death, etc. Right, now, I mean, these are moments, multiply that 100 times, yet you can see it's a part of the traumatic experience, you know, that one had during handling. I mean, I spent 2 years with this trial. Then, of course, we had to examine, by the way, also when one speaks of sentiments, I'm very often asked, you yourself, are you somehow a survivor of the Holocaust? He says, so just a few details which might be of interest. I mean, I was born in Germany, in a little township called Halberstadt, but at the early age of 2 months, I decided to leave Halberstadt. No, we left. My father was one of the leading Zionists of Germany, and he worked in heavy industry. Somebody had a big factory there, and he was the general manager, and that was transferred to Berlin. So actually, I knew Berlin only. I went, ironically, to the Theodor Herzl School of Adolf Hitler Square. It's also one of the ironies of fate. Anyway, we were very lucky. We left Germany in 1938, 2 weeks before the Crystal Night, or Kristallnacht, when all Jews were arrested, we went to Holland. And we left Holland in 1940, 1 month before the German invasion of Holland. And we came to Palestine, as it then was, on the ship, the Patria, which was sunk on the next journey after that, with 250 people killed. So we were always sort of just one step ahead. So everyone thought that my father had a sort of sixth sense as he went to detach himself. So when the German army afterwards, during the war, through Libya and Egypt, approached Palestine, everyone came to my father. And they said, where now? So he said, here is the last stop, here we won't budge. So then Rommel had to go back. Now you understand the real reasons behind history. Don't take me too seriously on that. But another thing which also, room for the, I told you in Germany I was in a Jewish school, Zionist school, Theodor Herzl school. But in Holland, I was actually in a mixed school in Amsterdam. But there were hundreds of Jewish pupils there as well in all the classes. And my best friend, who was not Jewish, he was afterwards the Dutch ambassador to the United Nations, he saw me on television in the Eichmann trial. So he contacted me in 1960. We re-established contact. I invited him to Israel, and then he told me that after the war he made some research, and he found out that of all the Jewish pupils in our school, that I'm the only one who remained alive. So, and then what really gave me the shivers, I later read in history books that between the outbreak of war in 1939 and March 40, when we left Holland, Hitler had fixed 7 times a date for the invasion of Holland, and every time he postponed it at the last minute. Once the astrologers told him that the star situation wasn't so good. Once they heard something on the BBC and they thought the British were suspecting something. A number of times weather conditions were bad, and that's why he postponed it when we were still there. And then the 8th time we were just left once before. So, when I then heard that practically, I think, no one escaped there from the Jewish pupils, the idea what life depends on gives you sort of room for thought. Now, I'm very often asked, after all, what actually did Eichmann? Eichmann, head of the Jewish department, yes, I want to tell you also before, if, let's say, I had carried out that investigation without any accused person or any suspected person being present, and one would have asked me later, you can have one person to put on trial, to really show all the aspects of the Holocaust. There's no doubt that I would have taken Eichmann, more than, let's say, people even of a higher rank, because he, as head of the Jewish department, he was responsible for all the aspects of the Holocaust. And not only that, as I show later, in the Gestapo, there were lots of departments in the security office, and lots of committees and heads of them, and they were all changed by rotation all the time. The only person who was kept all during the war in this position as head of the Jewish department was Adolf Eichmann, because he developed a complete identification, an obsession, that he thought it was his duty to see to it that no Jew in Europe or elsewhere, if possible, should be able to survive. Now, just one more point before I come to the legal points. During the trial, he said that this was the worst crime committed in history. So I was asked during the trial and afterwards very often, do you think he meant that sincerely? That, at least for the punishment, that could have been of importance. So I said, no, I'm sure that this was mere lip service to the outside. So they said, why do you say that? I said, well, I could imagine, even a man like that between the end of the war, 45, and 1961, when the trial took place, his eyes could be opened. He could have changed his opinion, that I don't, theoretically and practically, I don't think it's impossible. Every person must be given the benefit of the doubt. But here we had proof that in 1956, when he was in the Argentine, he was visited by a Dutch journalist called Zassen, a fascist. This man took his life story on tape, to publish it. It was a sort of life insurance for his family, that after Eichmann, if he would pass away, he would publish this for the family. But then when Eichmann was caught, he gave it to Life magazine, and we got it there, and we got the transcripts with Eichmann's corrections in his own handwriting. So there he described also to this Dutchman, he said, I saw the trains from Holland to Auschwitz. They went, nur so eine Pracht war. He said, it was marvelous to watch that. And then this Dutchman said, Mr. Eichmann, do you still feel sorry for what you've done? He said, yes, I feel sorry for one thing, that I wasn't hard enough, that I wasn't tough enough, that I didn't fight these damn interventionists enough. And now you see the result, the creation of the State of Israel and the re-emergence of that race there. So I said, if he said that in 1956, 11 years after the war, and now in 61, 5 years later, when he is fighting for his life, he suddenly speaks of a grave crime, the gravest crime in history, I think I'm justified to be a bit skeptical about, to put it mildly, about the sincerity or the truthfulness of such a remark. Now, I don't want to be too technical, legal, but things that doesn't have to be a jurist to understand. I imagine one of the things would be, and this was exactly one of the arguments also brought forward in the Nuremberg trials, that this law, which was passed in Israel in 1950 about Nazi criminals, Nazi offenders of the Nazi regime, this was a retroactive law. It was passed a law which referred to offenses that were committed before, in the 30s and the 40s and so on. I mean, Israel hadn't existed at that time. So here, in 1950, we passed that law. And they said that it's not just. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer in order to understand that it really is not, it sounds preposterous. If we do something now, which is completely legal, and then in 6 months' time, retroactively, someone will pass a law to make it even worse, to send us to death, this sounds unjust. But that doesn't, of course, refer to these circumstances here. When we made that law, we didn't create a new norm that it's forbidden to kill innocent men, women, and children. That was contrary to German law, that was contrary even to SS law, that was contrary to any kind of concept. Only the Nazis created a vacuum under which if someone murders a Jew, he would not be put on trial. So therefore, if one speaks of justice, justice demanded that forums should be put up that people like that could stand trial. And that same argument came after the war. I mean, also the Nuremberg trials were handled under laws and charters with retroactive effect. The same in Holland and in France and every other country. So there's nothing wrong with this. As I say, the rule against retroactivity is not a rule of law, it's a rule of justice. And here, the exact opposite, you see, justice demanded that in every country there should be a forum to enable people who murdered and committed these acts against innocent people should stand trial. But there was one thing which is more important, even mentioned by many Jewish professors and others, and that is that they said Israel is a Jewish state, and the Court of Israel is a court representing actually the state of the victims of these offenses. And therefore justice must not only be done, but also must appear to be done. And therefore a court representing the victims, that they are the ones that can charge and punish someone, that doesn't seem just. That was an argument, in fact, but I imagined immediately that would be put forward. Now, legally, of course, there's nothing to this, because actually the whole idea of criminal law is that a court representing a community, that is the court that judges a person who tries to harm that community. And that people shouldn't take families of a person murdered, or families of someone where a burglary was committed, that they should take the law in their own hands. It is the court representing that whole community that judges someone. As I said also during the trial, if someone in Turkey is found having committed treason against England. It's not a Turkish law that will judge him, but an English court if they manage to get hold of him. And I mean, I'll never forget, one day also a professor came to me from a European university, and he also made that point. And before I could answer, he said, "Could you show me the indictment against Eichmann?" So I showed him, and he saw that we charged him also with the murder of gypsies, and the murder of Russian commissars, and the murder of Poles and others, which was done by the same department. So he said, "Tell me, Mr. Bach, why did you charge him with that? Why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you leave that to the courts of Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc.?" I said, "Wait a minute, 5 minutes ago, you said yet you thought that a court representing a community against which a crime has been committed, that's not just to charge a man like that. But you seem to have no problem with the Russian court and the Polish court and the Czech court. But when it comes to a court of a Jewish community, you suddenly have these doubts." So the man had the decency to blush. And he said, "Well, I really don't know why I made that distinction. I have to think about it. I'll call you." He never called me again. But for me, that was very, very typical. And another thing at this connection, I'll never forget the first moment of that trial. You know, when these judges came into the courtroom with the Israeli emblem behind them, and that man whose only object in life had become to destroy these people, when he got up and stood to attention before a sovereign Israeli court, before the sovereigns of the sovereign state of Israel, the importance and the impact and the meaning of the creation of the state of Israel suddenly became clearer to me than at any moment that had preceded that, more than at any demonstration or anything like that. Then, of course, the kidnapping. They said that this man was kidnapped by Jewish agents, Israeli agents, therefore it's illegal and so on. Well, here we relied on American decisions. It happens very often in America, that someone commits a crime in a certain state and he escapes into another state, and the sheriff comes after him and takes him by force back to the state where the crime was committed. And there people argued that is an illegal, we were kidnapped from another state, and therefore the court has no right to judge us. And this came up all the way to the Supreme Court of America, and there it was held that if someone kidnaps someone and he's caught, he might stand trial for that. But that does not interfere with the jurisdiction of the court that has jurisdiction in the original way, and therefore this has no importance from the point of view of jurisdiction. The same was held in England. There were a number of cases. All this was we managed to overcome, and this is how we overcome. There's some more points, but many of them raised in the Nuremberg trials. That's maybe why I had the book then in front of me during some of the arguments. So, you know, very often I'm asked, tell me, there was, I think there's one picture there where, just yes, continue. Yes, another one. One more. Oh, this one. I very often ask, I mean, I don't know whether it's a good picture, but for me, it was not a post. That's not a post photograph. It was taken at a certain moment that I want to describe to you. You know, there was one witness, the only witness there, and the only person I think in the world who was inside the gas chamber that had already closed, and who could tell the story. This was a young boy at the time, and he was pushed with 200 other, I mean, usually they took 200 people into the gas chamber. And he described how they were in there, and the doors closed, it was dark, and he described how they began to sing, the children, to give themselves courage. And then when nothing happened, at first the children began to cry and to shout. And then the doors opened. Why? A trainload had arrived in Birkenau, Auschwitz, with potatoes, and there were not enough SS men to unload the train. So the SS commander had the glorious idea, why not use some of the children before they are killed to help unload the train? So they took the first 20 who were nearest the door, in order to help him. He was one of those. They killed the other 180 right away. And then, after the unloading, they killed all the others, but they said, the commander said that he had committed some negligence, had done some damage to one of the trucks. So he was sent to the camp to be flogged before being killed with the next group. The SS men had to flog him. And that SS man who carried out the flogging took a liking to him and kept him as his bedman, to clean the shoes. So this is how he managed to survive. He also described how he came to be in the gas chamber on that day. The children who could still work were used for a few days, but the ones who were too weak, who were too little, they were sent to the gas chamber right away. Now the Germans didn't want to examine every child, so they put up a sort of wicket, 2 vertical sticks and a horizontal one, and the children had to walk underneath that. And any child that didn't come up to a certain height was sent to the gas chamber right away. Now he was there with his elder brother, and he was very little, and he and his brother realized he wouldn't make it. So the brother took some stones and he put it in the shoes of his little brother. They should be a bit higher, and he also held him up. But the SS men saw that, so they shot the brother in front of him, and he was sent to the gas chamber. This is how he got to the gas chamber right away. Now, look, in this Eichmann trial, there were lots of cruel things that were described. But even this was something peculiar. So I remember exactly immediately after this witness, this photograph was taken of me when I sat down, because the judges said we have to make a break of 15 minutes. And so we had to, after we were dazed by this evidence, and when I sat down, someone from the press gallery took this picture of me, which has also a lot of memories. By the way, I want to say that I also was under shock, and I came into my office, and 2 minutes later, the door burst open, and the young defense counsel, one of the German defense counsels, who was a very sensitive young man, he came into my room, and he burst into hysterical weeping. And he didn't want people to see him that way. I didn't want people to see him that way, so I closed the door, and I prepared coffee for him, and I had to really to treat him in order to enable him to continue. One more thing that someone sometimes asks me, tell me, wasn't there a moment in this trial, with all your objectivity and knowing that you had your job to do and so on, where you somehow got me a breaking point? Well, I want to share this with you. There was a moment like this. Usually Eichmann sat in Berlin, pulled the strings. But when the German army entered Hungary, I mean his assistants were in charge of each one of the other European countries. But when the German army entered Hungary, who were actually allies of the Germans, but they didn't want to take part at first in the deportation, so Himmler decided that Eichmann himself should go there, the master himself, to prevent any mass escape or any uprising or anything like this. So Eichmann told us that when he got there, one of the first things that he did was that he gave instructions that the first Jews from Hungary were sent to Auschwitz before they were put into the gas chambers. They had to write postcards to their friends and families. And he dictated what should be in these postcards. We are here in a wonderful seaside resort called Waldsee. Wonderful excursions, very light work, but not enough room. So please come as quickly as possible in order to join us here in this camp, so that people should come, should go. Now, I was in charge of all the witnesses, among other things, also not only Western Europe, but also all the witnesses from Hungary, because that Eichmann was there in person, so with the largest number of witnesses we had from there. So I handled these witnesses, and on the day before the last of the Hungarian case, I heard there was a man in Israel who has such a postcard and was still alive. Managed to get hold of him. I said, come immediately to Jerusalem. He came at 11 o'clock at night. I tell this because usually I examined all the witnesses very carefully beforehand, but I never had more than 3 hours sleep during all these months. But anyway, that was, therefore, when he came, I said, show me the postcard, translated to me from Hungarian into Hebrew, which he did. And I said, you know, what happened to your family? Tell us tomorrow morning when I call you as a witness. So I also actually heard his real story next morning when he was on the stand, and he described how he had no idea what happened in Auschwitz. He came there, and he described he was with his wife and his son, 13, 14 years old, and his little daughter who was 2.5 years old, and he himself. So he described the selection: the mother to the left, the little girl to the left. You know, as Esmond said when they arrived there. He was asked, what was your profession? He said, I'm an army engineer. That's the right. And then the boy, 13, 14, the SS man said, I have to ask my superiors what to do here. And then he came back after a minute and he said, run after your mother. So the witness said, you could see in his eyes that he was back there. And he said, I looked, I thought, will my boy find my wife? Because hundreds of other people had walked in between. He said, I couldn't see my wife anymore. She was swallowed up in the crowd. I couldn't see my son anymore. He was swallowed up in the crowd. But my little daughter, she had a red coat. And that little red dot getting smaller and smaller, this is how my family disappeared from my life. Now, just by chance, I had bought my little daughter, 2.5 years old, a red coat just 2 weeks before that. And as I heard this for the first time when he said that, and it suddenly cut off my throat completely. I suddenly couldn't utter a sound. The witness recovered, waited for the next question. The judges gave me a sign to continue. The television was on me. But I started playing with my documents, and sometimes I cursed myself inside, but I couldn't. It really took a few minutes until I managed to really to continue. And I can tell you, I mean, I can sit in a basketball stadium, or I can be in a restaurant, or I can go out in the street, and suddenly I feel my heart beating, and I turn around and I see a little boy or a little girl in a red coat. That is something of the trial, in a way that has remained very much so until this very day. And I mean, there were a number of points, but this is something which, as you know, have you seen that film, The Schindler's List? Now there, of course, he didn't know that story, the people who prepared the film, but they read the record, of course, and the evidence of that man. That in itself, the fact that there was a witness who described this case of the red coat was enough to put this into the film and so on. But I mean, I don't know any one of these people, but of course some people from the American television heard about my personal history, and they actually questioned me on that as well. Now, as I want also to enable some questions to be asked, I would like to perhaps to summarize the importance of what happened in addition to doing justice. Of course, it's somewhere where 6 million people are murdered, and he described to some of his friends that he was, if ever he had to jump if he ever would die, he would jump into the grave laughing, because he knew that he had so many millions of Jews as responsible. You know, when the war, I mean, very often I'm asked, what made him tick? I don't usually like to describe any accused person as being only one thing. Only a murderer, only a robot, only a bureaucrat, only a Nazi. People are never only something. People are a combination. People pass through stages of development. I think that happened with him. When at first he became an expert in Jewish matters, he thought it was good for his career to ride forward on. But then he accepted this, and he then, you could see this, toward the end of the war, became absolutely obsessed with this. And he said to his friends, I know the war is lost, but I'm still going to win my war. And then he went to Auschwitz to get the death rate increased from 10,000 a day to 12,000 a day. When the German generals at the Eastern Front were clamoring for reinforcement, he managed to get priority for his death trains, when he must have known that that was actually harming the war effort. There was an attempt, for instance, what's typical, there was a suggestion that every German soldier who was 1/4 Jewish, one Jewish grandfather or one Jewish grandmother, should either be castrated, sterilized, or sent to a concentration camp. And Eichmann supported that vehemently. The one who objected was the commander-in-chief Keitel, not so much out of humanitarian reasons, but because he thought it would weaken the army at the end of the war. Here were these maybe thousands of soldiers who fought together with the others all the time. So he objects. Hitler supported Keitel. But Eichmann thought about it, that this should also be done. In that connection, just, jumping one part, but that is connected. There was a moment, usually, of course, when I heard the descriptions of the survivors, it had a terrible impact. But, there were sometimes afterwards, during my preparation of the trial, when I came across documents that somehow caused me not less concern, although some of these documents I didn't even use because the courts were very strict with us. They didn't enable us to put in any evidence which was not directly connected with Eichmann. But for instance, I want to tell you one of these things. One day I got across the Ministry of Health in Germany. They had a director general who was a doctor, person with a university education. And he wrote a letter to his minister. They had I don't know whether they have it today. If you have a blood bank, there was a milk bank, where mothers who had mother milk and their children had died, the babies, or they had too much milk, they could devote this, they could send the milk to this milk bank for mothers who wanted that. Now, this man described to his minister, there was a woman who was 1/4 Jewish. One Jewish grandfather, one Jewish grandmother, I don't remember. And this infamous woman, he said, donated her milk to this milk bank without disclosing that she was 1/4 Jewish. So he writes, my first reaction was that she should stand at show trial to be sufficiently punished for this infamous act that she's done. But then he added, but then I thought how demoralizing that might be for all Aryan mothers who might think that their babies were contaminated by the milk that they took from this milk bank. And therefore, I think, I suggest that this woman should just disappear in a concentration camp and never be heard of again. Now, you see, a man with the education, a university education, a doctor, writing a thing like this, I don't know, for me, all explanations are only partial explanation. One other thing, another document, before they had the gas chambers where people were put inside, they had gas vans, where people, Jewish families, were herded into trucks, and the exhaust, instead of going outside, was going inside, and the people were choking to death slowly. And then after 30 or 40 kilometers, they were sent into some cemetery and thrown away. Now, there was an engineer who wrote to either his minister or another superior a letter describing how these vans work, with the exhaust going inside. And then he added, I have, however, to make a suggestion. I think out of humanitarian reasons, we have to do something to protect our poor SS drivers from the necessity to listen to these shrieks from behind of the Jewish children and women that become softer and softer until they die. And therefore I've now found and have now invented a wall, a soundproof wall to put up behind the SS driver and the people beyond, that the SS driver does not have to listen to these shrieks that are getting softer and softer. You know, when I read humanitarian reasons, I thought something for the poor people there, but that was the only thing to protect our poor SS drivers, that they don't have to listen to the shrieks of the women and children that are becoming softer and softer. You know, these were certain things. We didn't even hand that into the court, but things that for me, every explanation is always only a part explanation. Now, just a few words on the final result. I mean, in Israel, lots of people, I mean, I told you, didn't want to hear about the Holocaust, and now, of course, they were confronted of this. It made an enormous impression. But one of the most important impressions was on our young people. Teachers and educators told me from schools that before the trial of Eichmann, many of the young people didn't want to hear about this. They were even a bit ashamed. A young Israeli can understand that in a fight you can be hurt, you can be killed, you can lose a battle. That he understands. But he cannot understand how millions of people can be put on trial without making an active resistance. And therefore they were ashamed, didn't want to hear about it. Now, that was not the main purpose of the trial, but we also wanted to show our young people that there was no reason here to be ashamed. On the contrary, we showed the almost scientific way in which the Nazis, I told you about these postcards that were written, but not only that, the way the Nazis prevented people from knowing whether they were gypsies or Russian commissars, also up to the last moment, they didn't know that what would happen, and then by all means, all sort of means, any resistance was opposed and prevented. And then, like in Warsaw Ghetto, when the Jewish people there realized that that's what's confronting them, the incredible courage with which the people, the citizens of Warsaw Ghetto, defended themselves up to fought gallantly and courageously up to the very last moment, before most of them, sometimes up to the last man, were killed. So therefore, there was even reason to be proud and not to be ashamed. And that has a terrific result. Our young people started to be interested in literature of Jews in Europe. They were interested in history. They wanted to visit the death camps. That was one of the results of the trial. And another thing in Germany, I was told by German teachers and German prosecutors. German teachers wanted to bring to the schools. Prosecutors wanted to put on trial Nazis in the various concentration and death camps, but they were never given budgets. They were never given encouragement. The parents who were Nazis, of course, they didn't want the children to know about this. But even the ones who were not Nazis, they didn't want the children to come home and ask, where were you? Why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you demonstrate? How could you stand this and not do anything? So they preferred that this should not be brought into the schools. But then the Eichmann trial came, and this came into every person's home for an hour, so they couldn't stand anymore in the way of these teachers who wanted to bring this into the schools. So there was a terrific impression of that. And then the prosecutors, those prosecutors who wanted to bring these trials, no one resisted anymore. So then all the big trials in Germany about Auschwitz and Majdanek and Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor, all that was brought after the Eichmann trial. A bit late, but still better than nothing. And now, for instance, amongst many Germans, when they say, all right, an Israeli, all these denials, people who deny that the Holocaust has ever taken place, and which is so ridiculous, but many people believed in this. When they heard the Eichmann trial, all right, the Jewish court has decided that. But now, when we have one case after another, with the meticulousness of German courts, where they describe what happened in every one of the death camps, and we have historic documents now to prove that, there is also something of great importance. And then, of course, that people should know, whether they are in Yugoslavia or whether they are in Africa or in South America or some other place, where they have a possibility sometimes or an inclination to commit genocide of that form, that people should know that then, even after a period of 15 years, I mean, this is what happened here in 61 after the war, that there still is for them a danger if they give in to this kind of inclination, that there will be an investigation, that they might be charged, and that they might be punished in the heaviest form possible. And I mean, as most of you know, in Israel, we abolished the death sentence for murder and other crimes, but we still have it for genocide, for these Nazi crimes. We still have it for terrorist acts of a serious nature, and we still have it for treason in wartime. But no person in Israel has ever been sentenced to death and executed except Eichmann. And here there was also an argument amongst some of the prosecutors. They said, well, after if he went on appeal, the appeal was rejected. After that appeal, maybe 5 or 6 weeks later, he should be executed. I objected to that because I was afraid that if the judgment is final, then I was afraid the Nazis might take a little Jewish child somewhere in America or somewhere in South America or in Portugal or wherever, and say they will do something to that person. And therefore I suggested that, I mean, his family asked for a pardon. That I said, if the president decides to pardon him, all right, that's it. But if the president does decide to reject that, then they should broadcast this at 11 o'clock at night, and at 12 o'clock the execution should take place. And that was what was in fact done. So now I think, as I said, the interest in this case is growing tremendously, and as I say, from year to year, and in many articles they say that this is really from the point of view of genocide. In fact, the word genocide was invented by a person called Raphael Krebkin, a survivor from Poland, and it was for the first time used in one of the indictments in Nuremberg. It was there mentioned in connection with war crimes and not with crimes against humanity, which should have been the proper thing. But anyway, it was mentioned. It was not, the word genocide of Jews was not mentioned in the final judgment of Nuremberg, but it was mentioned during the trial, and that has also now become one of the most important points which are raised in arguments in connection with criminal genocide and that is committed anywhere in the world. Therefore, I don't think this is just a sort of a personal feeling that those 2 years, I mean, I never had routine cases. It was always a combination, sort of one adventure, one after another. As when I was state attorney and when I was judge, and there's sort of lots of things that are remembered very vividly by me. But this still is the essential piece, which is impossible to forget. And thank you very much for enabling me to tell this story. So that she could make her own opinion on that. So I want to tell you, in her book, not only did she express very strange ideas, but she falsified all the main documents that were quoted by her, saying exactly the opposite from what was written there. I told you the story of this the Hungarian business with the instructions that Hitler had given. Now here I want to tell you, just to give you an example of an extreme case, Admiral Horthy, he was the one who was in Hungary. He was the leader of Hungary at the time. And he was not so much in favor of deportation, so of Jews. So at the border, Hitler and Horthy met. Hitler asked for that, and he tried by threats and promises to influence Horthy to agree to the deportation of the Hungarian Jews. Finally, Horthy agreed, but he made one condition, number of conditions. One condition was that 8,700 Jews from Budapest should be permitted to go to a neutral country, and Hitler agreed, because for him it was more important that Horthy should cooperate with him also during the war and also about the deportation of the Jews, rather than this 8,000. How do we know all this? In the archives of the German Foreign Ministry, we found a telegram written by the German ambassador to Budapest, von Wesenmeyer, to Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister of Germany, and there he described the agreement between Hitler and Horthy, and including the 8,000 Jewish families that should be permitted to leave. But then he adds, I have, however, to inform you that the local representative of the SS, Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, was very upset when he heard about the arrangement between Hitler and Horthy, because he thinks these 8,700 families that might be important biological material, and they might from these neutral countries even come to Palestine and create the Jewish state there. And therefore Eichmann has given instructions that the deportation of Jews from Budapest should now be speeded up at such an extent that until the visas can be arranged to these neutral countries, no 8,000 Jews should remain in Budapest. Now, I handed in this document at the time, during the trial, with a special stress. This shows that this was not a small cog. This was not a man who just carried out orders. Here he had a decision of Hitler, of the Führer himself, who had made that arrangement. So he tried to prevent even that. I mean, that really was one of the most important documents in the trial against Eichmann from the point of view of his personal involvement. So what does Hannah Arendt? She writes, the prosecutor dealing with Hungary made a big fuss about the telegram sent by the German ambassador to Ribbentrop, the minister, only because the document shows that Eichmann was not prepared to obey Himmler's orders when they were contrary to the opinion of the Führer Adolf Hitler. Now here, it's Himmler had nothing to do with this. This was an arrangement between Hitler and Horthy, quite clearly from this document. It's shown quite clearly, and she completely falsified it. Now this man, Jacob Robinson, who wrote this book, And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, all this book, if you can get hold of it, you can see 250 or 300 pages, where he writes about the falsifications in the book of Hannah Arendt, and he describes this one page after another. She wrote also, for instance, that by painting Eichmann so black, that thereby we decreased the guilt of Hitler and Himmler and these people. I mean, and Heydrich. I mean, it's the other way around. The fact that we showed that here, as I told you, the other leaders were changed by rotation, that Eichmann, who was so completely fanatical about this, that he was kept there, that doesn't decrease the guilt of people who, of course, are guilty of him, like Hitler and Himmler. They were the originators of the idea. He only carried it out. But the fact that they kept him there is only because they realized how obsessed he was with this complete identification with this criminal scheme. This is, can tell you one thing. Also, she described that there were Jews in Poland who cooperated with the Nazis in the sense that they prepared sometimes lists of people in their little villages that were supposed to be sent. They did this to save themselves and to save their families. So she writes that the prosecution, they did mention this, that we did show that. But if we had stressed it more, this might have been a mitigating circumstance for Eichmann to show that people under extreme circumstances, they commit sometimes crimes and you cannot blame them so much about it. Now, I found, this comparison terribly difficult, but it was typical for me to see. I mean, Hannah Arendt was Jewish, but the main defense counsel of Eichmann, Dr. Savatius, whom you see there, there on this picture there at the end. He was one of the defense counsels at the Nuremberg trials. He defended Saukel, the Minister of Labor, and the Nazi Party. We really also we had a very cordial relationship. He came to me one day and he showed me 12 letters of Israelis who had written to him. They were prepared to testify for the defense. Why? Not so much to help Eichmann, but you know, like in the Kasten affair, which many of you may have known about, there were always Jews who tried to save some of their families and some of their friends by negotiations with the Nazis and with others and with the local police, etc. And these people, some of them succeeded, some did not succeed. The ones that did not succeed were sometimes angry at the ones and described them as traitors who were prepared to cooperate with the Nazis and with the others and so on. And just like Hannah Arendt says, that this might have been a mitigating circumstance for Eichmann. These people thought that Servatius, the defense counsel, would be interested to bring in these things to show that there were some Jews who cooperated with the Nazis. So Servatius came to me and said, look, Mr. Bach, if I thought that this would help my client, I would have had no choice. I would have to bring these things. But to me, this is not a mitigating circumstances. The fact that they killed some of the souls, managed to destroy the souls of some of the people before they destroyed their bodies, to me that is an aggravating circumstance and not a mitigating circumstance, that they used this cat and mouse game, and that Eichmann and these people used this cat and mouse game with these poor people who were there in these camps. To me, that is something which makes it worse, and therefore I'm not going to go into this. You see, but here is this man, not being Jewish, he understood better than anything that Hannah Arendt ever did. And so, I mean, I give you dozens and dozens of examples. If you're interested, you can read it in this book by Jacob Robinson, one of the advisors of, as I told you, of Jackson. And there you can see how absolutely devoid of any logic and truth is this, what she describes about the Eichmann trial.
I think you should have a conversation with Ahmadinejad, who denies the Holocaust. My question is, there were and still are Germans who were civilians and soldiers in the army who deny that they ever knew anything that was going on with the Jews. Do you believe that?
Not really. I mean, I very often say, look, I was as a child, as I told you, until the age of 11 in Germany. And then these people didn't know anything. I think up to a certain stage, it's quite possible that most of the Germans didn't know the full extent of the gas chambers and of the killing and the murder of millions of people. That may be, maybe they thought they were going to the east, and many people died, they surely knew. But I said, when I was in Berlin, when we went into a park, I mean, there were lovely benches, but there were benches where it says only for Jews, you know, yellow benches where all Jews had to sit. Now that everyone saw. And it was terribly demoralizing for the Jews who had to live there. For us, who were Zionists, we sat there and sang Hebrew songs. So it was, for us, perhaps not so terrible, but still, of course, it was frightful. And I also never forget, my father was very busy in his factory where he worked, but in weekends we went to the Grunewald, you know, the wonderful forest next to Berlin. And there we played football, and then we went sometimes on a general motorboat, you know, on the lake of Wannsee. So at every corner in the streets in Berlin, they had this Stürmerkasten. Stürmer was a newspaper, an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, and a Nazi paper that was published at every corner. So one day I saw a picture of our family in one of these motorboats, and it says, "Jews still dare go for a hike on the Wannsee. Now, that of course is something that everyone must have known and everyone saw and so on. So then, quite possible that quite at the beginning of the Holocaust, that many people in Germany, in fact, they tried to hide this. Then came the famous Wannsee Conference. I mean, Hitler in 1941 decided that all Jews should be killed, all Jews of Europe. At first, this was only carried out by the people of the Eichmann and others. But then Eichmann and Heydrich decided that that it has to be brought to the attention of all the ministries. So they had the famous Wannsee Conference, which was in Villa Wannsee near Berlin. And there they brought it to the attention. Eichmann told us that he and Heydrich were were full of trepidation. Why? Because many of the director generals of the ministries who were invited to this meeting were jurists. So they thought, if we tell them that we are going to kill millions of innocent men, women, and children, there will be some criticism. Some people will object. So then he described to us how the evening went off, and apart from some technical questions, no criticism whatsoever. So then, after the people left, he and Heydrich sat before a fireplace and drank to cheer about their victory. They drank a schnapps, a brandy, and another one, 3 brandies were drunk there, and so on. So it was about 4 years ago, I think. I was invited to speak on German television, and then I was taken to this Villa Wannsee with some professors who deal with the Holocaust in German universities. So we were sitting and having coffee. Suddenly I saw we were sitting in front of a fireplace. So I said, tell me, is this the fireplace where Eichmann and Heydrich drank the schnapps, the brandy, in order to cheer themselves at their victory? He said, exactly. So I must admit the coffee did stick in my throat a little bit. But anyway, it was now last year. It was 65 years, in 2007, 65 years since this. So I was invited not only to make the main speech there, but to conduct the whole evening. And there were hundreds of people from all over Germany. And I was in this Villa Wannsee, in this main hall there, and I told them that story. And this fireplace still exists, so you should have seen the people who were sitting next to this fireplace, how they sort of try to move away from there. But I want to tell you also, I mean, I'm regarded as a notorious optimist. I mean, the fact that this, especially in Germany now, we were invited last year to 6 different occasions. There was this swing of the Wannsee. Then I was invited to the Nuremberg. This is where also Eli Rosenbaum was there. And there were hundreds of people. Actually, there were 3 people who actually conducted cases against the Nazis. One of them, Windy Harris, the one who appeared in the Nuremberg trial. The other one, Professor Ferenczi, who dealt with the Einsatzgruppen, the ones where they murdered people by shooting, and myself about the Eichmann trial. But there were hundreds of other people there, and I'll never forget the president of the Nuremberg court. He came to me during that Congress, and he said, Mr. Bach, there are hundreds of people here, I can't show everyone, but I want to show you something special. So he took me down to the cell of Goering, and he showed me the cell of Goering, and went in there, and he said, now I want to walk with you the way Goering went on the day in which he heard his death sentence. So we went there, the corridor, and up the elevator. It was a rather eerie feeling. And then we were in Frankfurt, and then I was now in Holland. I mean, all this the last years, and some amazing things happened in the world. I mean, there are some friends of Israel, for instance, in Japan. Oh no, before that, I wanted to tell you about this man, Jacob Robinson, I told you about, the advisor of Jackson. So last year, I suddenly got a phone call from the German ambassador to Lithuania. And he said, Mr. Bach, you don't know me, but I know you about your task in the Eichmann trial. And I'm sure you remember Jacob Robinson. Now, maybe you don't know, Jacob Robinson was born in Lithuania. And before he went to America, he was active even in the official life of Lithuania. but he died exactly 30 years ago. So the German and Lithuanian authorities have decided to devote a whole day to the memory of Jacob Robinson, and they want to invite you to come to Kovno and to make a speech, you know, and to in memory of Jacob Robinson. I was a bit ashamed because this was a man of us. We should have we should have remembered that he died 30 years ago. So suddenly the German and Lithuanian authorities, I mean, they had a really very, very impressive day. I mean, this was remarkable. Then just to say, all this happened now in the last year. In Japan, there is a pro-Israeli group, and they, a Jewish group, they have put up a museum, a Holocaust museum, in the name of Anna Frank, you know, the girl from Holland. And that already was put up. One was put up 10 years ago, and then I was invited to give some lectures there on the Eichmann trial, other things. And there they brought from Holland, from the garden of the Frank family, a bunch of roses, and they planted these roses in the garden of that Holocaust museum. And they asked me to plant a tree in my name next to the rose of Anna Frank. So now, 2 years ago, I suddenly got a picture of my tree, you know, my name, which has blossomed, and this. But anyway, this is so successful. They take every day 200 children to show them that, especially the murder of children. And now they have decided to put up a bigger place, not far from the old one. And they asked me to come to Japan in order to open that for them and to be part at the ceremony. And when I got there, this was just now less than a year ago, so they said, would you be prepared to speak to some of our friends in Kyoto? Kyoto, this is where the headquarters is. I said, yes, why not? I thought 30. He said, we want to hear how you see the future of the relationship of the pro-Israeli Japanese and Israel and so on. So I said, yes, why not? I thought 30, 40 people would come. I got in there. There were 2,000 Japanese waiting, amongst them 300 children, beautifully dressed. And when I got in, they all got up, and in perfect Hebrew, they sang, Havelu Shalom Aleichem, we brought peace on you. I must have said, I had tears, it was incredible, you know, and they all sang, and then they said, go up to the podium to speak, and before I could start my speech, they put down a screen and showed a film on my life. Now, how come? 3 weeks before I came, they had called me by telephone, and they said, look, could you send us some pictures as you as a child, as a state attorney, in the Eichmann trial, as a judge? I said, why do you need that? So they said, well, some of our children, they want to know the person who's doing the opening of this museum, what he looks like. All right, so I sent some pictures, I forgot all about it. And then they had prepared a film. I mean, just I tell you, little things like that. And then, of course, in Holland, they called me, and the people who were in charge of Holocaust, fighting Holocaust and so on. And, well, I saw in this something positive. Some people on German television, they asked me, for instance, they said, tell me, but you see the neo-Nazis now, you see the young, don't you think that the whole thing is just like it was before? I said, well, of course, this should be objected to, and this is dangerous, and so on. And yet, what we see now is what is shown by German television. You know, some of most of these things. When I was there in the 30s, no one showed that on German television. And there are thousands of young Germans who go and demonstrate against that, which also didn't happen in the 30s. And apparently these things are getting weaker and weaker. And I said, of course, it's not enough. I would call on these young Germans, it's not enough that they should feel that they are against it, but they should, I expect them actively to fight against all these new things. But from all I've seen, you know, when just one more thing, the place, this state, Sachsen-Anhalt. Sachsen-Anhalt is one of the states of Germany, one of the biggest ones. They have a parliament of their own. Now, again, last year, they called me the president of the court, of the parliament. He said that they decided every year to devote a whole day of their parliament to remember the Holocaust. And they asked me to make this year, now 2008, to make the main speech in their parliament about the Holocaust. And when I got there, I got a tremendous reception there. And at the end of this procedure, they asked me to open a museum against anti-Semitism, against anti-Israelism, and against anti-Zionism in their parliament. I mean, these little things, one should not forget, and they, to me, justify my general optimism about things.